Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Leo Beck Institute Book Club's latest installment, where we're going to be discussing the book 4,000 Lives, The Rescue of German Jewish Men to Britain, 1939. This is a book about the history of the Kitchener camp, which was in Sandwich, Kent, England. It was, as we all know, if we have read the book, no guilt otherwise, but that it was not an internment camp. It was actually a camp set up by Jews for Jews who were trying to get out of Germany and Austria, and it was actually something that operated originally alongside the Kinder transport when Britain, to use the term loosely, decided to try and rescue German and Austrian Jews. So I'm pleased to say we have with us today Professor Clare Ungerson. She is the author of this book, and I'm going to briefly introduce her before we begin. Hold on here. Professor Emerita Clare Ungerson was born in London to a German Jewish mother, originally from Stuttgart, and a Jewish father who was born in London. Her maternal grandparents also managed to get out of Germany just in time at the end of June 1939. She was brought up in a secular household, as were many people of a German and Austrian Jewish background. Clare read philosophy, politics, and economics at the University of Oxford and did a master's in social policy at the London School of Economics. She then became an academic in the field of social policy, ending up as a professor of social policy at the University of Southampton. On retirement, she moved to Sandwich in East Kent, where the Kitchener camp was located. Her book, 4,000 Lives, which we just read, was a retirement project for which she fortunately found a commercial publisher. The research for the book was mainly conducted in London and Jerusalem, and I'm happy to say she has just celebrated her 80th birthday. So Clare, I'm excited for your talk to begin, and I'll pass it over to you. So you can go ahead and you can just let Monica know when you need the slide changed.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Michael, and welcome to everybody. I can't see anybody.
You won't see anyone.
No, that's fine.
In this part, you will after your show.
But it's amazing to me that we can do this. That I'm in Sandwich and you're all in, or some of you are in New York, and I gather that some of you are from much further afield and some of you are from England and Europe. So welcome. Monica, can you move on? Thank you. When I was appointed as a lecturer at the University of Kent, which is in Canterbury, which is 12 miles west of Sandwich, that was in 1973, and I inquired, where is there, what's a good place to visit? And everybody said, oh, you must go to Sandwich. And they were quite right, because Sandwich, I doubt any of you have been to Sandwich, but it is a very exquisite little medieval town. And I'll come back to some descriptions of Sandwich a bit later on. But it is a very interesting town and said to be the most complete medieval town in England. And wondering about, I came across this plaque, which I now know had only very recently been put up on one of the two medieval gates, which still exists in Sandwich. And the plaque, as I now know, was put up by the Association of Jewish Refugees in 1972. So it had only recently been put up when I came across it. And the wording of it, which is very difficult to read actually in reality, but this is what it says. This plaque is to commemorate the Richborough Transit Camp 1939 to 40, where 5,000 men found refuge from Nazi persecution on the continent. During the Second World War, most of them volunteered to fight for the Allied cause, erected in gratitude to the citizens of Sandwich and East Kent, who, as in the past, welcomed the refugees. Well, when I saw this, I was completely mystified by it. I think those of us in the second generation do.
Why video? Open video.
Sorry?
Well, that's what this is.
That's okay. I'll tell them. Could everyone please silence their microphones? So that would be helpful. Thanks. Go ahead, Claire.
Thank you. Anyway, I was completely mystified by this because as somebody brought up in a refugee household, you sort of absorb bits of your
Give
family
here
history.
view options, for instance.
There's somebody still talking. Never mind. I'll try and ignore it.
All right. Yeah.
I had never heard of the Richborough transit camp and the astonishing fact that apparently 5,000 men found refuge from Nazi persecution on the continent. So that was the first mystery. The second mystery was it didn't say that these men were Jews, but it seemed to me that they had to be. They couldn't be anything else. And that seemed very strange, that a plaque had been put up which clearly must refer to Jewish men, and there was no mention of them being Jews. And the third mystery was, why was it men? And why were there no women? So having seen that plaque, I thought that's an interesting story, but it's not something that I can pay any attention to because I haven't been appointed as a historian, and I'm not a professional historian. I was appointed to teach social policy, which is a completely different area of study. So I sort of put it in my back pocket and moved on, but was very fortunate in my retirement to be able to come back to it. Can we go to the next slide, Monica? So it is a very surprising, untold story because as I discovered much later, the plaque is inaccurate in many ways, and there were never 5,000 men living in what I came to know was called the Kitchener camp, not the Richborough transit camp. There were at its maximum capacity, just under 4,000 men living in the Kitchener camp. The number is not comparable, clearly, to the nearly 10,000 lives of unaccompanied children that were saved by the Kindertransport. But nevertheless, it's a substantial number of refugees. It's estimated about 70 to 80,000 German-speaking Jewish refugees managed to get to Britain from 1933, between 1933 and 1939. So it's a small percentage, but nevertheless, it's a significant number. What I later discovered when I started doing research into the Kitchener camp, and it's called Kitchener because it was a First World War camp originally, and Lord Kitchener was the commander of the British forces in the First World War until he drowned, actually, in 1916. But it was called the Kitchener camp, and there were 7 First World War camps around Sandwich during the First World War, and this was one of them. What I discovered when I started doing research was that this was a very similar rescue to the rescue of the Kindertransports. It's exactly the same origins in Kristallnacht, or Crystal Night, as it's sometimes called, the great and terrible pogrom of November the 9th and 10th in 1938. And that it was treated by the Central British Fund for German Jewry, who funded this rescue, as they also funded the Kindertransports, as complementary. The two rescues were complementary. And I'll come back to exactly how they were complementary in a little while. The two rescues were organized in exactly the same way. The children set off from Berlin and Vienna. The men, who were, many of them, had just been discharged, as it were, from concentration camps to which they'd been taken after Kristallnacht, also boarded trains in Berlin and Vienna. The children came a somewhat different route and finally landed at Harwich, which is a port on the east. It's also on the east coast but north of the Thames, in England. And they came to a central London station called Liverpool Street Station. And there is now a really rather good statue of the children arriving outside Liverpool Street Station. The men came a somewhat different route. They came through Belgium and boarded ferries to cross the Channel at Ostend in Belgium and arrived at Dover. And Dover is 16 miles away from Sandwich. Turning to the context, as I've already mentioned, it was a refugee camp funded and managed by the Central British Fund for German Jewry, which was an organization rather like your, I don't know if you still call it the Joint Distribution Committee, but it was a large fund run by very rich Jews, to put it bluntly. Rothschild, Davido Goldschmidt, Montefiore, long established Jewish families who'd managed to make it in the 19th century in England, were the people on the committee of the Central British Fund for German Jewry. They managed to persuade the American Joint Distribution Committee to make a 20% contribution to the costs of running this Kitchener Camp rescue in the first year. And they also persuaded the Home Office, the British Home Office, which was in charge of refugee policy, to relax the visa arrangements until the Kindertransports and the Kitchener Camp rescues. The only way in which refugees could come to Britain was if they had a financial guarantor living in Britain who could guarantee that they would not, the refugees would not become a charge on the British state. If they could demonstrate that, then they were able to enter Britain. There was no quota. It was just, if you could find yourself a financial sponsor and somebody to guarantee you, that would allow you entry. And what the Home Office agreed, as far as the two rescues were, well, not leaving aside the Kindertransports, just talking about the Kitchener Camp rescue, they agreed that the Central British Fund could act as the financial guarantor for all the refugees coming to the Kitchener Camp. So that was a flexible policy, which meant that the refugees coming to the Kitchener Camp would be would have to be selected in some way, and that was left to the Jewish agencies. That selection process was left to the Jewish agencies in Berlin and Vienna. But there were some conditions that the Home Office insisted upon. First of all, they said the refugees had to be in transit. In other words, they had to have some evidence that they wouldn't stay in England for much longer than a year. And that evidence could be a high likelihood of being allowed into the United States, a high likelihood of being allowed into Palestine. And at that time, of course, Britain was running the mandate in Palestine and had, at that stage, in 1938-9 had severely restricted the numbers that could emigrate to Palestine, or they could show that they had tickets to leave Britain on a ship going anywhere in the world. And that is how a great many men came, actually, that they could demonstrate that they had tickets, in particular, to sail to Shanghai, which also had no quotas, and to which many German Jewish refugees did actually go. There was a large refugee community in Shanghai during the Second World War. And the second condition that the Home Office insisted upon was that the refugees coming would not be allowed to work. The same condition is now applied to all refugees coming. It continues, and refugees and asylum seekers now coming to Britain are not allowed to work until they're given the right to stay here. The camp started, it was located at what had been a secret First World War port known as Richborough, and it started as a refugee camp in February 1939. That's when the first refugees started to arrive in very small numbers at first. The great acceleration took place in June and July 1939, but in small numbers they began to arrive from both Berlin, but most particularly from Vienna, from February onwards. And it continued, this camp continued as a refugee camp until the fall of France in May 1940, when it was very suddenly closed down, because of course Sandwich is pretty close to France. It's across the sea, admittedly, but it's only 22 miles away from the coast of France. And the feeling was that you couldn't have Germans living so, once war had broken out, living so close to France, because there was no knowing whether they were spies or not. But that's partially another story. The Central British Fund decided that the camp should house what they considered to be young men. And they took the minimum age to be 17 and the maximum age to be 45. And the reason for the minimum age of 17 was because the maximum age for the Kindertransport was 16. So that's one of the demonstrations as to how they saw these two rescues as directly complementary. But obviously, given that age range, 17 to 45, it was actually possible, and there were some fathers and sons who came together. It was possible to fit in two generations for some families. And the Central British Fund also said that, or advised the agencies in Berlin and Vienna that were making the selections, that the men had to demonstrate urgency. And by urgency, they meant they're either in concentration camps already, or they're directly threatened with being taken to concentration camps imminently. And some of you may know that after Kristallnacht, 30,000 men, no women, were arrested and taken to 3 concentration camps, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, and Dachau. And many of the men who came to the Kitchener camp had in fact been in one or other of those camps. Okay, can we have the next slide? So as I've said, the selection of the men was undertaken by the existing Jewish agencies in Berlin and Vienna. And the Viennese agency had a particular problem because they were in the same building, the Rothschild Palace, it so happens, as Adolf Eichmann, who was, of course, as we know, in charge of the ethnic cleansing of Greater Germany. And he moved the Jewish agency into the Rothschild Palace so that he could have control over it. And he claimed to be a Zionist because he was extremely keen on getting Jews to move to Palestine. And he was extremely keen on getting the Jewish agency to get as many Jewish men out of Greater Germany and to the Kitchener camp. So he would every week meet with the men, and they were all men working in the Jewish agency in the Rothschild Palace, and scream and shout at them and assault them sometimes about increasing the numbers that they were getting out of Austria mainly. The camp, the Richborough Transit Camp, or the Kitchener Camp, or whatever you want to call it, had been a First World War camp, and it had been empty since 1918. So we're talking basically empty for 22 years. So it was in a very bad state. And the Central British Fund was very keen that the men who came should be artisans and that they should have skills appropriate both for putting the camp to rights, for rebuilding the huts and so on, but also for cooking, for example, for running the kitchens. So they wanted plumbers and glaziers and roofers and cooks and hairdressers and printers, because they wanted a camp magazine, watch repairers. They wanted men with artisan skills. And there is some evidence that actually the Jewish agencies were quite successful in finding men with appropriate skills. But of course, they had to leave their families, although it would have been their families, particularly for those that were in concentration camps, who would have done the work of getting permission for these men to come to England. And when I looked at the data that I could find, it seemed to me that there were probably quite a high proportion of unmarried men, and that in a sense there'd been some self-selection, that men were coming who perhaps they were leaving their parents, but they were not necessarily leaving wives and children, although many of them did leave wives and children. And I'll come to that later. And as I've said, they came to England on trains via Ostend and arrived at Dover and were then given, stamped into their passport, leave to land on condition that they came to the Richborough camp. And they then got put onto another train and came 16 miles to Sandwich, and where they were met and taken in a large flatbed lorry to the Kitchener camp, which was about 15-20 minutes drive away. Now, I thought I'd just tell you something say a little bit about Sandwich, because it's such a very odd place in a way to have a very large population of German-speaking Jewish men living on its edge. It, as I've already said, is supposed to be the most complete medieval town in England. I live in it, and we have town walls, we have a moat, we have a quay, we have two medieval gates, one of them known as the Barbican Gate, which is where this plaque is. And in the 1930s, the population of Sandwich was just under 4,000. So given that the camp was expected to house at least 4,000, and the initial number that they aimed for was 5,000, it really, there was going to be another town on the other side of a bridge which crosses the river in Sandwich. It was a market town, small shops, a weekly market. There was a cinema which opened in 1938. But in the summer, Sandwich expands. It still expands. We have two very posh golf courses here, and very posh people come to live in Sandwich, still do, in the summer. And Waldorf and Nancy Astor, Waldorf Astor, an American, and his wife, Nancy. Nancy was the first woman MP to take her seat. Harold and Dorothy Macmillan. Harold Macmillan was a prime minister, an English prime minister post-war. The Prince of Wales, the one that ran off with Mrs. Simpson, and his then mistress, Mrs. Rita Dudley Ward, and a fascist, Captain Robert Gordon Canning. And he had a house on the edge of the most important golf course. And there were organized fascists in the town. Gordon Canning was one of them. And then there was another very rich woman called Lady Grace Pearson, who was the British Union of Fascists parliamentary candidate for Canterbury at the time. And can you move on, Monica? I'm just going to show you some pictures of Sandwich, just to give you an idea. These were taken by a colleague of mine. The first one just shows you Sandwich. It's a small medieval town, as you can see. The half-timber building that you can see in the picture on the left is the Guildhall, and I'm actually deputy mayor. So it's a lovely building, and if you ever come to Sandwich, you'll have to come and visit the Guildhall. And the other picture on the right, I myself took actually last night, and it's of the bridge. It's known as the Toll Bridge, and it's a swing bridge. And it's the bridge that the men would have crossed as they walked from the camp, which is about 5 minutes walk away from the bridge, and walked straight into Sandwich. Can you show the next slide, Monica? I'm sorry, I had to omit some slides because it was too big an attachment to send to Michael. But I would have shown you a picture of what the men would have faced when they walked across that bridge, and they would have been, they walk that would have taken them straight into the middle of Sandwich. But on the edge of Sandwich was this old First World War camp, and here's a rather grim photograph of it, with what's now known as the Stonar Lake in the background. And the Stonar Lake is actually the old medieval port, which silted up, and that's how the golf courses have come to be built on the silt. But the camp is really close to Sandwich, about 10 minutes walk, as I say. And it was run basically by two brothers. And this is a photograph of Jonas May, obviously standing outside one of the huts. Jonas was the director of the Kitchener camp, and he was employed by the Central British Fund because he called himself Colonel May, not because he'd been a colonel in the First World War, he'd been too young, but because he was a colonel in the Jewish Lads Brigade, which was a sort of Boy Scout organization for Jewish boys. And it was thought that given his experience of running summer camps for Jewish boys, he was the obvious candidate to run a camp of possibly 5,000 German-speaking Jewish refugees, many of whom straight out of concentration camps and would have been extremely traumatized. But nevertheless, he was thought to be the right person. Can you move on to the next slide, Monica? And this is his brother, Phineas May, in his Pioneer Corps uniform, and I'll come back to the Pioneer Corps. And he called himself the Entertainments and Welfare Officer. And we have to be very grateful to Phineas, because he realized, as soon as he arrived at the Kitchener camp, he realized that something very important was happening. And he kept a daily diary. And he must have sat down at the end of every day from February the 8th, I think it starts, but maybe it starts a bit earlier than that, early February 1939, until the end of August 1939. He sat down every night and recorded what had happened during that day. It must have taken 20 minutes, half an hour. And fortunately, he kept his diary and he deposited it at the Wiener Holocaust Library, which is the main Holocaust library in England. He also took photos and he deposited his photo album. And I'm going to show you some of the photos that are from Phineas's photo album. The first one is of men at work, and you can see there that they're working hard, digging trenches, probably for drainage and for lavatories and whatever was necessary. And it was a very hard working day. The men were expected to be at work from 7:30 in the morning until dusk. And they were also expected to work on Saturdays. In fact, they were the more Orthodox Jews objected and said they didn't wish to work on Saturdays, and Jonas persuaded them, saying it was a mitzvah, that they had to work on Saturdays because they had to make this camp fit for further refugees who were waiting to come to England. And they conceded that they would work on Saturdays. Can we have the next slide? One of the ways in which the camp management, I think very successfully and I think perfectly consciously, decided they would manage relations between the camp residents or inmates or whatever you want to call them, and the people of Sandwich, was to use local providers of services. So at an early meeting, almost as soon as the camp had started in February 1939, Jonas and Phineas went to a Chamber of Commerce, Sandwich Chamber of Commerce, dinner dance. And the president of the Sandwich Chamber of Commerce at that time was Lady Grace Pearson, the fascist. And Jonas made a speech, which is fully reported in the local newspaper of the time, saying that he was going to use local farmers and their produce. He was going to use local coal merchants, and he was going to use local builders. And here we have a photo of builders, local builders. I'm sure they were not refugees, typically dressed with cloth caps and so on, mending a roof. And in fact, the camp had a monthly magazine called the Kitchener Camp Review, and there are a number of reports in that camp magazine about friendships developing between the refugees, who of course were doing similar work to the builders, the sandwich builders, and friendships developing between the refugees and local builders. And there's a lovely memoir by somebody called Peter Mansbacher. His original first name was Fritz, but he changed it to Peter. And Peter's memoir is deposited in the Wiener Holocaust Library. And he went for a Sunday lunch to a local builder who invited him. And the way he describes that Sunday lunch is really extraordinarily moving, because he suddenly found himself back in the bosom of a family. And of course, what had happened to him was he'd had to leave his family. It's a very touching account, and I do quote it in my book. The camp itself was not comfortable. It wasn't Dachau, but it wasn't private. And you can see here a typical hut. And each of the huts housed about 84 men. And they put up a partition. I don't know quite why, but this is one half of a hut, which would have housed 42 men. And there is another photo, which I'm not showing you here, which has a slogan on that partition at the back. And it says, "England expects every man to do his duty. You are not Englishmen, but you must do your duty." And I think that rather reflects a sort of hierarchical and somewhat authoritarian atmosphere atmosphere in the camp itself, although there was also a system of self-government. Can we have the next slide? The camp flag was raised, I think, on March the 1st, and as you can see, it's the Union Jack. And there aren't that many men standing around it, but it was a big day. And in the Kitchener Camp Review, Jonas May, yes, it was raised on March the 1st, and he gave a short speech, and this is what he said. "We know what this flag means to you. It means freedom. Freedom that I hope will never be taken away from you again. Freedom that I hope will now be yours to the end of your days. When we have sent the flag up, we shall sing God Save the King. And I want you to sing it with all you have got in you and with all your heart, because our King represents the freedom which is so important to us all." Well, some people might quarrel with that now, but Phineas, his brother, had rehearsed them, and they knew the British national anthem. And Phineas had said in his diary, he had explained to them that we must stand to attention when we sing it and remove our hats. They then sang it, and I have never heard it with much more feeling. Of course, what's very important is that Germany and Austria, of course, after the Anschluss, they'd lost their national flags. It had been replaced by a swastika. But I think also the fact that the Union Jack flew outside the camp has added to the misapprehension which many, certainly American correspondents, people who've written to me about how their fathers were interned in the Kitchener camp. And I think it's possible that some of the men did actually think they were being interned, but they weren't. They'd been rescued by a Jewish organization. But I think the fact that that they sang the national anthem and that the flag was outside the camp possibly added to a misapprehension about why they were all confined to a camp, although they could come and go. I mean, it was not like an internment camp. They were able to leave the camp once they'd done their work, as and when they wanted. There was a library, and you can see another slogan here, "Please keep quiet." Can we have the next? And there were other pastimes. Here's some men playing chess. And I should tell you that the man on the right, the somewhat plump man, he was one of the refugees who was able to get his family out. There were compulsory English lessons, and that in fact they had 87 voluntary English teachers coming from roundabout to come and help people, the refugees, learn English. And he talked to his English teacher, a woman, and he told her that he had left his wife and his daughter in Vienna, and he was desperate to get them out. And she said, "Well, that's all right, because we already have a little girl." And she and her sisters, her spinster sisters, had taken in a little girl from the Kindertransport. And it would be very nice for their little girl, the one that they'd taken in, that they'd fostered, to have a companion. And they also said that they knew people who wanted a domestic servant who lived in London. And there was another scheme which allowed Jewish refugees to enter England if they could get posts as a domestic servant. It was known as the Domestic Service Visa Scheme, and it was administered by the Central British Fund for German Jewry with the consent of the Home Office. And this gentleman, was able, as a consequence, his wife came to London and worked as a domestic servant, and his daughter came to live with these three maiden ladies who lived in a village about, I should say, 20-minute cycle ride away. And his daughter, who I knew much later as Stella Curzon, she told me that her year in Minster, living with these lovely ladies, whom she called her aunts, and with this little girl who was already there, and going to the primary school in Minster, was the happiest year of her life. I was absolutely bowled over by it. And her father used to cycle out to see her every Sunday. So that was a success story in terms of getting that family out. There was a theatre, and there were many concerts to which local people flocked. Phineas records between 800 and 1,000 people coming to these concerts, which were held on Saturday night. And the German refugees in particular had been encouraged to bring musical instruments with them, which they did. And there was a proper orchestra. There was a jazz band as well, which gave free concerts up and down the coast that summer. Can we have the next slide? There were drama competitions, and I always show this photograph in order to emphasize that there were no women in the camp. And you can see that this is Hut 41 because they're holding it up. So it says Hut 41, and there's a man dressed as a woman. Goodness knows what they were going to do, but I expect they were going to put on some kind of play. Ramsgate is a town about 5 miles away, a seaside town, and it has an annual carnival, still has, and they sent a float to the Ramsgate Carnival, and this is a picture of the float. And can we have the next slide? And here you can see a side view of the float, and what you can't see, because it's very difficult to see, it says on the side, "Our thanks to England." And they obviously used what they could get hold of. So there's a bunk bed on the float. And the men, some of them had managed to bring accordions with them. And a lot of them seem to wear these, what I call +4s. I don't know what you call them. These trousers with sort of baggy trousers, which are short. You can see. And I think they thought this is what English gentlemen wear or something. It's a very odd. Lots of them wore these +4s. So when I first approached this story, I thought, why hasn't anybody written about this? This is a happy story. And you'd think that somebody would have written about it. But there was a considerable downside. Clearly, many of these men had come from concentration camps, and they had been brutal regimes, absolutely brutal. It's estimated that there was a death rate of about 15% in those three concentration camps. That some of the men were clearly totally traumatized, and there are reports, particularly in Peter Mansbacher's memoir, of madness. And I think there were at least 2 suicides. So there was both terrible post-traumatic stress disorder, as we would call it now, terrible nightmares, people reporting being kept awake by men screaming in their sleep. They'd had, so many of them had to leave their families behind. In Jerusalem, I found in the archive there, Norman Bentwich's papers, a list of 582 children whom the men hoped would be allowed into this country. And most of them I discovered by using the Shoah database. I found the transports that the children had sent on. And later on, after the fall of France, those men that had not joined the Pioneer Corps, they were all given the opportunity to join the Pioneer Corps, which was the unarmed bit of the British Army. Those men that were not, had not joined, and there were many different reasons for them not enlisting, were later interned, about 600 of them. And some of those men, about 250, were later sent on the Dunera, which some of you may know the story of the Dunera, to Australia. So they had, some of these men, a pretty awful time, both in the camp and after it. And I think that's one of the reasons why so few men actually told their families about it. It had not been a good experience for them. Can we have the next slide? But there is an upside. I managed to interview a number of the men who were still alive. And it seemed to me that they had made reasonable new lives in Britain. And many of them had married, although, you know, having been married and having left wives and children behind, they then made new families. What they didn't really, the ones that I talked to, didn't really want to talk to me about the Kitchener camp, though. What they wanted to talk to me about was what had happened immediately post-war, because it seems to me that it's almost certain that the majority of them were used by the British government as part of the denazification process immediately post-war, and also as part of the war crimes process. And the men that I talked to, most of them, had been sent back to Germany after the war was over to be part of those two processes. And that was, for them, a really satisfying process, and what they really wanted to talk to me about. And the other upside is that despite the presence of these two rather important fascists, Gordon Canning was a very good friend of the leader of the British Union of Fascists, and Lady Grace Pearson was also an important fascist. And they feature in books about fascism in Britain in the 1930s, both of them. Nevertheless, it seems to me that there probably was no upsurge in anti-Semitism. Certainly the Central British Fund sent a spy to discover about the extent of anti-Semitism just as the camp was opening. And he said, nothing to worry about here. The only fascists here are the employees of Lady Grace Pearson. And they sent another spy to report in November 1939, and that person said nothing to report at all. So it doesn't seem to me that there was an upsurge in anti-Semitism. And I've got a little puff for myself, the book of the story, which some of you may have read. Thanks very much. That's the end of it.
Thank you, Claire. That was a really good talk, and I think everyone learned a lot in the book, well, in the book and in the converse and in your talk. So thank you. And it's also exciting that you're really right there in Sandwich, where the Kitchener camp. I know, right? And I also didn't realize your important place within the civic administration.
Oh, yes, I'm deputy mayor.
Wow, well, congratulations. That may says something about Sandwich itself, perhaps.
Well, there's deep hostility. They say I'm not the right person to become mayor, or somebody, an ex-mayor has written to the town clerk to say I'm not the right person to be mayor because I don't support the traditions of Sandwich. Well, I read that, I'm afraid, as anti-Semitism. But anyway, that's another story.
Yeah, an interesting one, though. So let's open it up to discussion.